Imagine for a second getting a letter in the mail.
Okay.
It's a formal, desperate invitation from a
Right.
family member. They're telling you that their house has been completely destroyed, right? They are in absolute dire straits, and they need you, specifically you, to come over and help them rebuild.
Right. A real SOS.
Exactly. So, you pack up your entire life. You make this really arduous journey. You arrive, you roll up your sleeves, you do the heavy lifting, and you literally fix the foundation of the house.
Yeah.
But then at the end of a grueling day, when you ask this family member for just a blanket and a place to sleep, they slam the door right in your face.
Wow. I mean, it's an incredibly jarring image.
It really is.
And that deeply contradictory experience being, desperately needed but simultaneously rejected is the exact reality of the era we are exploring today.
It is. Welcome to today's deep dive.
Mm-hmm.
We are unpacking a very specific, intense 14-year window in British history. We're talking about the period from 1948 to 1962.
Which is such a brief window of time, historically speaking.
Yeah, but it permanently altered the cultural landscape of the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
So today, we are going to explore the stark contrast between the legal, open-armed invitation extended to the Windrush generation of Caribbean migrants and, well, the cold reality they actually faced once they stepped off the boat.
Right. And to really grasp the magnitude of that contrast, we have to establish the context first.
Absolutely.
While the story of the Windrush generation is famously anchored to the summer of 1948, which is when the HMT Empire Windrush arrived at Tilbury Docks, we actually have to look slightly earlier.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we need to examine the really powerful forces that were simultaneously pushing and pulling this generation across the Atlantic Ocean.
Because nobody just wakes up and casually decides to, leave their home, cross an ocean, and start over in a place with completely different weather and culture.
Yeah.
Not unless massive forces are at play.
Exactly. It's never a casual choice.
So let's look at Jamaica in 1947. It's described in our sources as an economic pressure cooker.
Right.
But I'm curious about the mechanics of that. What exactly was driving that pressure?
It was a confluence of really severe economic crises. You have to remember the global context right after World War II.
Right.
You had thousands of Jamaican military veterans who had served the British Empire during the war returning home.
Wow, thousands.
Yeah, and these are highly disciplined, capable men returning to an economy that just had zero jobs for them.
And the land itself had been physically devastated just a few years prior by the Great Hurricane of 1944.
Yeah, absolutely. That hurricane essentially obliterated the rural agricultural economy.
Just wiped it out.
It literally wiped out the banana crops and the coconut plantations, and those were massive employers at the time.
So you have a huge population of able-bodied people living in an agricultural society where the agriculture has just temporarily ceased to exist.
Precisely. The economy simply could not sustain them, and that is your ultimate push factor.
Makes sense.
The choice becomes incredibly stark. Do you remain in an economy where you literally cannot feed your family, or do you take a massive leap of faith across the ocean to the quote-unquote mother country?
Right. And then on the other side of the ocean, you have the pole.
Yes.
The United Kingdom is sitting there war-weary with its cities literally physically bombed out. They are trying to clear the rubble, rebuild their society, and, importantly, launch this massive new public project, the National Health Service, the NHS.
Which was a monumental undertaking.
Yeah, but they have an acute labor shortage. They literally do not have the human hands required to do all this work.
Which forces a fundamental shift in the legal framework. To solve this labor crisis, the UK passes the British Nationality Act of 1948.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this feels crucial.
It's a monumentally important piece of legislation. It formally recognized citizens of the UK and colonies as British subjects.
Meaning what exactly in practice?
Meaning they were legally permitted to live, settle, and work in the United Kingdom without any need for a visa. They were British.
Wait, I want to pause on this 1948 Act because it feels very counterintuitive to how we understand borders today.
It really does.
They weren't setting up, like, a temporary worker program. They were granting blanket citizenship rights to people living thousands of miles away. Did the British government at the time not foresee the massive demographic shift this would cause?
It's a great question, and it speaks volumes to the mindset of the British establishment at the time.
How so?
Well, they viewed the empire as a massive, unified resource pool. There was an assumption, and perhaps an arrogant one, that they could simply call upon colonial subjects to act as an emergency workforce.
Like flipping a switch.
Right. And they thought they could do this without significantly altering the social fabric of the domestic UK. They were just primarily focused on the immediate operational emergency of rebuilding the country.
And those arrivals certainly answered that emergency. I mean, Jamaicans quickly became the operational backbone of post-war Britain.
They absolutely did.
But we're not talking about comfortable desk jobs here. These were grueling, heavy-lifting roles.
What's fascinating here is that we often talk about the economy as an abstract concept. But the work the Windrush generation did was the fundamental physical infrastructure required to keep a damaged nation from collapsing.
Yeah, the specific roles mentioned in the sources are incredible to think about. Jamaican nurses and midwives were the ones staffing the midnight shifts on the early wards of the National Health Service.
They were there at the very birth of the modern NHS.
Exactly. And then you have men and women becoming the drivers, the conductors, and mechanics for London transport,
Yeah.
keeping the whole capital moving.
Oh, and it extended way beyond that into the postal service, automotive factories, and the construction trades.
Wow.
They were quite literally laying the bricks to rebuild the bombed-out cities. They were everywhere the country desperately needed them to be.
Which brings me to the cognitive dissonance of this whole situation, because it really trips me up. The British public trusted these Jamaican arrivals to deliver their newborn babies. They trusted them to care for their sick relatives. They trusted them to safely navigate the iconic double-decker buses through London traffic.
Yes, the most essential tasks.
But once the shift was over, they refused to treat them as human equals. Like, how does a society reconcile trusting someone with its health and infrastructure while despising their presence in the neighborhood?
It's baffling, but that dissonance is the defining characteristic of what became known as the cold reality of settlement.
A cold reality.
Yeah. The workplace was one thing, survival there was dictated by sheer operational necessity. But the domestic sphere housing, neighborhoods, social life, that was governed by deep-seated prejudice.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The physical reality of trying to find a place to live was notoriously harsh.
Unbelievably harsh.
You arrive as a legal British subject, you work a 12-hour shift at the hospital, and then you walk down a residential street looking to rent a room. And you are met with those infamous boarding house window signs.
The no blacks, no Irish, no dog signs.
Yeah, just grouping people with animals.
Those signs became the visual symbol of systemic hostility. But it wasn't just about offensive signage. It was about the underlying mechanism of a complete housing freeze-out.
Right. Let's dig into that mechanism. Because if the mainstream housing market completely shuts you out, where do you actually go? How do you survive when a piece of cardboard in a window explicitly denies you shelter?
Well, you are forced into the hands of exploitative landlords.
Ah,
Yeah, when a
yeah.
system denies you access to the broader market, you have to go where landlords are willing to turn a blind eye to societal norms, and that's usually in exchange for exorbitant rent.
So they were getting price gouged on top of everything else.
Exactly. Landlords would take these large, dilapidated Victorian houses that were just falling apart, subdivide them into tiny, cramped spaces, and rent them out at a massive premium to Caribbean migrants who had literally no other options.
So it was a dual exploitation, essentially. The government is getting cheap labor to rebuild the country, and predatory landlords are draining those wages by overcharging for squalor.
That's spot on.
And because these specific landlords only operated in certain rundown areas, it forced the migrants to cluster geographically, right?
That is the key point. The creation of famous Caribbean enclaves like Brixton, Notting Hill, and Birmingham's Handsworth, that wasn't a case of migrants choosing to self-segregate.
It wasn't by choice at all.
No, it was a direct geographic result of systemic housing hostility. They clustered together for sheer survival.
It makes perfect sense. I mean, if you're completely alienated everywhere else, you build a sanctuary. But sanctuaries can quickly become pressure cookers, right?
Oh, absolutely.
You have an unwanted population doing the hardest work, crammed into exploitative housing, surrounded by a hostile host population that just feels like a powder keg waiting to go off.
And that powder keg exploded exactly a decade after the Empire Windrush arrived.
The 1958 riots.
Exactly. The friction of this localized housing crunch and the growing demographic shifts boiled over into the Notting Hill race riots of 1958.
How did it escalate from, like, housing tension to full-blown riots, though?
Well, you had working-class white residents who were themselves experiencing economic anxiety and really poor housing conditions.
Right.
But instead of looking at the systemic failures of the post-war recovery, that anxiety was directed at the highly visible Caribbean enclaves.
Classic scapegoating.
Exactly. It was sparked by localized violence and then just quickly escalated into sustained clashes over several days.
For the Windrush generation, that must have been a profoundly dark realization. I mean, the 1948 Act was just a piece of paper.
That's all it was.
Legal citizenship did not shield them from being physically attacked or treated as unwanted foreigners in a country they were actively rebuilding.
It stripped away any lingering illusions about the mother country, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And rather than defending their legal citizens from racist violence, the political establishment actually began to shift its stance.
Wait, they turned on them?
Yeah, as the visual makeup of British cities changed, political attitudes hardened. The open-door policy that had so desperately called them over was suddenly framed as a national crisis.
Which leads us to the Commonwealth Immigrants Act of 1962.
Right.
This is the moment they basically changed the locks on the door.
Mm-hmm.
The era of free movement officially ended, replaced by strict work voucher controls designed to drastically curb Caribbean arrivals.
A huge turning point.
How did those vouchers actually function in practice, though, to stop the flow?
It was a bureaucratic chokehold. Instead of explicitly passing a law saying no Caribbean migrants, which, would have caused massive international outrage across the Commonwealth, they instituted a system where you needed a specific employment voucher before you could even travel.
Oh, so they just made the paperwork impossible.
Exactly. And the government tightly controlled the issuance of those vouchers, effectively strangling the migration route without ever explicitly mentioning race in the legislation.
It's a classic administrative maneuver.
Yeah.
Get the labor you need, then totally change the rules of the game.
Sadly, yes.
So what does this all mean? Did the 1962 Act actually work in the long run? Did it erase the impact of the Windrush generation, or was that 14-year window enough time to cement their presence?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the legislation absolutely stopped the mass movement of people, but it was far too late to reverse the cultural shift.
The roots were already there.
Exactly. That 14-year window from 1948 to 1962 laid a permanent, immovable foundation. The families who survived the physical hardship, who endured the exploitative housing, who stood their ground during the 1958 riots, they forged an entirely new British Caribbean identity.
And they didn't just survive. They completely altered the cultural landscape of the UK. We see this massive introduction of ska and reggae music alongside new political mobilization.
Huge impacts.
But how did that culture manage to permeate the mainstream if the communities were so heavily segregated?
Because culture is fluid, especially among the youth. While the older generations may have maintained really strict societal boundaries, younger working-class Britons were living shoulder to shoulder with Caribbean youth in these urban centers.
They were just growing up together.
Yeah, they shared physical spaces, they went to the same underground clubs, they listened to the same sound systems. The music ska, rocksteady, and eventually reggae, it spoke to a shared working-class experience of marginalization.
Wow, that's fascinating.
It really is. It bypassed the political hostility entirely and became deeply embedded in British youth culture.
It's incredible to think about the lasting footprint here. For anyone listening right now, whether you're navigating the modern multicultural streets of a British city or relying on the modern NHS or just listening to certain genres of music on your commute, you are interacting directly with the legacy of that specific 14-year window.
Absolutely.
It's a legacy born out of the grit and resilience of people who answered a desperate call for help and simply refused to be broken when they were betrayed.
It proves that while laws and work vouchers can control borders and demographics, they are entirely powerless to control culture. The cultural impact of the Windrush generation vastly outlasted the very laws designed to contain them.
It's a remarkable transformation. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, specifically regarding that new political mobilization we just touched on.
Okay.
We've talked about the intense betrayal they faced, fixing the family house only to have the door slammed. We know that the housing hostility and the 1958 riots forced the community to actively mobilize and organize politically just to survive.
Yeah.
So consider this. If these early pioneers hadn't been forced to immediately mobilize politically just to survive the harsh betrayal of their mother country and the 1958 riots, would the British Caribbean cultural identity be as profoundly unified and influential as it is today? Did the very hostility meant to marginalize the Windrush generation actually forge the unbreakable solidarity that allowed their culture to conquer Britain?
That is a really powerful question.
Something to think about.